May 3, 1943. North Atlantic, 400 miles west of Ireland. Commander Daniel Harrington watches through his binoculars as the conning tower of U-538 slips beneath black water, disappearing into the safety of the deep Atlantic. His destroyer, USS Borie, could pursue. Standard doctrine demands it. Drop depth charges, force the enemy deeper, maintain contact until the kill is confirmed. But Harrington does something that will get him court-martialed or decorated, depending on how the next 72 hours unfold. He orders his ship to turn away. His executive officer, Lieutenant James McKenna, stares at him in disbelief. "Sir, we had solid ASDIC contact. That boat's running at 60 feet, well within kill range. We can put a pattern right on top of her." Harrington keeps his eyes on the swells where the U-boat vanished. "Belay that order, XO. Log the contact, mark the position, and resume convoy escort duties. We're letting this one go." The bridge falls silent. In 18 months of Atlantic convoy duty, no one has ever heard a destroyer captain voluntarily abandon a confirmed U-boat contact. It violates every principle of aggressive naval warfare that has governed destroyer operations since John Paul Jones. But what Harrington's crew doesn't know yet is that 40 U-boats are about to slip through American fingers in exactly the same way, and within 72 hours, every single one will be dead. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The pattern that would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare began not with a brilliant tactical innovation, but with a supply crisis that threatened to lose the war before American forces could bring their industrial might to bear. By spring of 1943, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than American shipyards could replace them. Admiral Karl Dönitz had over 200 operational submarines prowling the Atlantic, organized into coordinated wolf packs that struck convoys with devastating precision. The mathematics were brutally simple. Each U-boat sunk approximately 8 merchant vessels during its operational lifetime. American destroyers, operating under conventional doctrine, achieved an 11% success rate when engaging submerged submarines. For every U-boat destroyed, Allied forces lost 72 merchant ships to enemy action. At this rate, Britain would be starved into submission by autumn, regardless of how many tanks rolled off assembly lines in Detroit or how many bombers lifted off from English airfields. Commander Harrington understood these statistics better than most destroyer captains because he'd spent 3 months at the Anti-Submarine Warfare Tactical School in Norfolk before taking command of USS Borie. The instructors there taught aggressive pursuit tactics, immediate depth charge, attacks, and relentless pressure on any detected enemy contact. Standard doctrine emphasized that submarines were most vulnerable immediately after diving, when their crews were still scrambling to secure equipment and their captains hadn't yet established proper trim at depth. But Harrington had also studied captured German technical manuals that revealed uncomfortable truths about Type 7C submarine capabilities. These boats could dive to 300 feet in emergency situations, well below the effective range of standard Mark 7 depth charges set for 150-foot detonation. They carried enough battery power to run submerged for 20 hours at cruising speed, or 48 hours if they reduced to minimal electrical consumption and drifted with ocean currents. Most importantly, German submarine doctrine emphasized evasion over engagement when facing surface warship attack. U-boat captains were trained to dive immediately upon destroyer contact, then proceed underwater for at least 6 hours before considering a return to surface operations. The tactical logic was sound. American destroyers couldn't maintain high-speed ASDIC searches for more than 4 hours before fuel considerations forced them to return to convoy escort duties. By the time the Hunter departed, the prey had vanished into 3 million square miles of empty ocean. The realization that conventional tactics were failing came to Harrington during convoy HX-237 in April, when his destroyer group made contact with 6 different U-boats over a 72-hour period. Following standard doctrine, they pursued each contact aggressively, dropping over 100 depth charges in coordinated attack patterns that should have devastated any submarine caught in the blast radius. 0 confirmed kills. Not a single oil slick, debris field, or surfaced survivor to validate their efforts. Meanwhile, the convoy lost 9 merchant ships to torpedo attacks that seemed to come from submarines that should have been running for their lives instead of maintaining offensive operations. Harrington began asking questions that made his fellow destroyer captains uncomfortable. What if aggressive pursuit was exactly what German submarine commanders wanted? What if every depth charge attack was simply buying U-boats time to escape while destroyers were pulled away from convoy protection? What if the entire tactical doctrine was designed for a different kind of warfare against opponents who fought by different rules? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Sterling, a British Royal Navy exchange officer serving as convoy commodore aboard merchant vessel SS Empire McAlpine, had been tracking U-boat attack patterns using nothing more than a notebook and considerable analytical skill. Sterling's observations revealed something that official intelligence reports had missed. German submarines attacking HX-237 had not scattered randomly after American destroyers began their aggressive pursuit. Instead, they had reformed into coordinated positions within 24 to 36 hours of initial contact, suggesting they weren't fleeing to distant patrol areas but rather hiding temporarily before resuming offensive operations in the same general vicinity where they'd first been detected. Sterling presented his analysis during a convoy conference aboard USS Borie on April 28, spreading hand-drawn charts across Harrington's wardroom table. "Commander, look at the timing patterns. U-338 made contact with the convoy at 02:15 hours on April 26. Your destroyers pursued for 3 hours, dropped 46 depth charges, then returned to screen positions. 30 hours later, a merchant ship reported torpedo track from bearing 115, exactly where U-338 would be if it had simply hidden underwater for 6 hours, surfaced to charge batteries, then returned to the same hunting ground." Harrington studied the timeline with growing recognition of a pattern he'd been too close to see. The same sequence had occurred with U-584, U-261, and U-719. Each submarine had drawn American destroyers into futile pursuit actions, then returned to offensive positions after the hunters departed. The Germans weren't running away, they were playing for time. But if Sterling's analysis was correct, it revealed a vulnerability that conventional doctrine couldn't exploit. American destroyers operating under standard pursuit procedures were optimized for immediate engagement, not for the patient waiting game that submarine warfare apparently required. Fuel capacity limited high-speed operations to roughly 6 hours before destroyers had to throttle back to economical cruising speed or return to base for refueling. ASDIC equipment worked most effectively at speeds below 15 knots, making it impossible to maintain both a high-speed pursuit and effective sonar contact simultaneously. The tactical problem seemed insurmountable until Harrington considered what would happen if American destroyers simply stopped pursuing altogether. What if instead of chasing submarines into the depths, they marked contact positions and waited for mathematical certainty to force German boats back to the surface? Type 7C submarines required surface time for battery charging, diesel engine maintenance, and fresh air circulation. According to captured technical specifications, they needed approximately 4 hours of surface operation for every 12 hours submerged at patrol speed. This wasn't tactical preference. It was engineering reality dictated by battery chemistry and mechanical limitations that no amount of German ingenuity could overcome. If American destroyers could predict when and where U-boats would be forced to surface by their own technical limitations, they could position themselves for attacks against vulnerable enemies rather than wasting depth charges on submarines that were already beyond effective engagement range. Harrington drafted his proposal as a tactical modification to existing doctrine rather than a revolutionary new approach. Naval institutions didn't reward revolutionary thinking, but they sometimes accepted incremental improvements that achieved better results without challenging fundamental assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. His memorandum suggested that destroyers encountering U-boat contacts should mark positions accurately, maintain passive sonar monitoring, and return to offensive action only when enemy submarines were forced by engineering constraints to become vulnerable again. The response from Task Force 24 Command was predictably skeptical. Captain Thomas Hendricks, commanding destroyer squadron from USS Buck, believed aggressive action remained the only proven method for keeping enemy submarines suppressed and protecting merchant convoys from sustained attack. Commander Harrington, your proposal asks us to abandon confirmed contacts in favor of theoretical predictions about enemy behavior. Naval warfare isn't mathematics. It's about will, determination, and maintaining constant pressure on opponents until they break. The moment we stop pursuing submarines aggressively, we hand them freedom of movement and tactical initiative. But Rear Admiral Wilder Baker, commanding Task Force 24 from cruiser USS Augusta, recognized something in Harrington's analysis that resonated with his own frustrations about convoy protection effectiveness. Baker had lost 37 merchant ships under his command in the previous 2 months, while his destroyers claimed only 3 confirmed U-boat kills. The mathematics suggested that conventional tactics were failing badly enough to justify controlled experimentation with alternative approaches. Commander Harrington, you'll have one opportunity to prove your theory. Convoy ON 184 departs Liverpool on May 1st with 53 merchant ships and 6 destroyer escorts. Your ship will serve as tactical commander for the destroyer screen. You may implement your modified doctrine with full authority to position your forces as you see fit. If you achieve measurably better results than conventional pursuit tactics, we'll consider wider implementation. If you fail, you'll return to standard procedures and face a board of inquiry regarding your unauthorized deviation from established doctrine. The convoy formed up in the North Channel on the morning of May 1st under overcast skies that promised foul weather ahead. 53 merchant vessels, everything from American Liberty ships hastily constructed in West Coast yards to elderly British freighters that had been crossing the Atlantic since the previous war. Their holds carried Sherman tanks, aviation gasoline, tinned food, ammunition, and the industrial output of a nation finally bringing its full productive capacity to bear against Axis powers. Harrington's destroyer group consisted of 6 ships: USS Borie, USS Goff, USS Clemson, HMS Vanessa, HMS Wanderer, and HMS Viceroy. Not the newest vessels in either Navy's inventory, but experienced crews who'd been fighting the Battle of the Atlantic long enough to understand that survival depended more on tactical skill than on advanced technology or superior firepower. The first U-boat contact came on May 3rd, exactly where German submarine tracking intelligence had predicted the enemy would concentrate forces against westbound convoys. U-538, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Werner Schultz, spotted ON 184 at 07:15 hours and immediately transmitted a contact report to U-boat headquarters in Paris. Shadow contact, convoy course 245 degrees, speed 8 knots, estimated 40 merchant ships, light escort. Schultz followed standard Wolfpack doctrine perfectly. He didn't attack immediately. Instead, he maintained visual contact from maximum range while transmitting position updates that would guide other submarines toward the target. Within 4 hours, 3 additional U-boats had vectored toward ON 184's position. U-419, U-637, and U-758 formed a loose patrol line ahead of the convoy's projected course, preparing for coordinated night surface attacks that had proven devastatingly effective throughout the winter months. Harrington received the initial U-boat sighting report from HMS Viceroy at 07:28 hours. Standard doctrine demanded that at least 2 destroyers break formation immediately to pursue the contact, forcing the enemy to submerge and hopefully destroying it before it could guide additional submarines to the convoy. But Harrington issued orders that made his bridge crew exchange nervous glances. All escorts maintain current screen positions. Log U-boat contact bearing 093 degrees. Range 11 miles. Monitor but do not pursue. Mark exact position and note time of contact. Lieutenant McKenna, his executive officer, moved close enough to speak without the rest of the bridge crew overhearing. "Sir, that U-boat is going to shadow us all day and bring half the German submarine fleet down on our heads. Doctrine exists for good reason. We can't just let enemy submarines operate freely around the convoy." Harrington kept his binoculars trained on the horizon where U-538 remained just visible as a dark shape against grey swells. XO. That submarine made contact 73 minutes ago. If we pursue now, Captain Lieutenant Schultz will dive to 150 feet and proceed underwater at 4 knots while we waste 2 hours dropping depth charges on empty ocean. When we return to convoy duties, he'll surface again and resume shadowing from a different bearing. We'll have accomplished nothing except pulling 2 destroyers away from convoy protection during the most vulnerable daylight hours. But, sir, we can't just ignore confirmed U-boat contacts. We're not ignoring anything, Harrington replied quietly. We're changing when we choose to engage. That U-boat needs to surface for battery charging within the next 18 to 24 hours. When it does, we'll know exactly where to find it. The tactical gamble played out over the next 12 hours as U-538 maintained its shadowing position, while 3 additional submarines took station ahead of the convoy's projected course. German radio traffic, intercepted and partially decoded by Allied intelligence, revealed that Captain Lieutenant Schultz was transmitting regular position updates to U-boat headquarters, never suspecting that American destroyers were deliberately allowing him to operate freely. By late afternoon, Harrington had accumulated position data on 4 separate U-boats, each one tracked carefully but never engaged. His destroyer captains were growing increasingly uncomfortable with orders that contradicted everything they'd been trained to believe about aggressive anti-submarine warfare. Only Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Sterling, watching from the merchant ship he commanded, recognized the mathematical beauty of what Harrington was attempting. The convoy commodore sent a brief signal by Aldous lamp as evening approached. "Your German friends are getting awfully confident. Hope you know what you're doing." Harrington's response was equally concise. "Faith in mathematics, Commodore. Check back in 72 hours. As darkness fell on May 3rd, the German submarines prepared for coordinated surface attacks that represented the deadliest phase of Wolfpack operations. U-boats running on diesel engines could make 17 knots on the surface, fast enough to overtake a slow-moving convoy, and position themselves for bow torpedo shots that gave merchant vessels almost no time to maneuver. The night attacks had been devastating Allied convoys throughout the winter, with individual submarines sinking 4 or 5 ships before diving to evade counterattack. But tonight would be different, because tonight, Commander Daniel Harrington wasn't fighting the battle everyone expected. He was preparing for a completely different kind of warfare, one where patience mattered more than aggression and mathematics trumped conventional wisdom. The question wasn't whether German submarines would attack. The question was whether they'd still be alive in 72 hours to regret that decision. May 3rd blended into May 4th as convoy ON-184 steamed westward through moderate seas under a moonless sky that favoured submarine surface operations. Harrington stood on Borie's bridge drinking coffee that had gone cold hours ago, watching radar screens that showed merchant ship formations maintaining their assigned positions, while his destroyer escorts circled the convoy perimeter like sheepdogs guarding a flock that was about to be attacked by wolves who didn't know they were walking into a carefully prepared trap. The first torpedo struck at 02:33 hours. SS William Cullum, an American Liberty ship carrying aviation gasoline and trucks in convoy position 4-3, exploded in a fireball visible for 20 miles. The ship broke in half and sank in under 4 minutes, taking 37 crew members down with it. German submarine U-637 had achieved perfect firing position without ever being detected by the destroyer screen that was supposed to protect the convoy from exactly this kind of attack. Standard doctrine demanded immediate reaction. Destroyers should race toward the attack bearing, illuminate the area with star shells, and hunt for surfaced submarines that might still be visible on the surface. Depth charges should saturate the waters where the U-boat had fired from, forcing it deep and hopefully destroying it before it could maneuver for additional shots. Harrington did none of these things. All escorts maintain screen positions. Mark attack bearing and time. Do not pursue. The radio crackled with protests from his destroyer captains who couldn't understand why they were being held back while merchant sailors died in burning oil. HMS Wanderer's captain, Commander Peter Ashford, transmitted in barely controlled fury. Borie, this is Wanderer. We have clear bearing to attacking submarine. Request permission to engage immediately. Negative. Wanderer. Hold current position. Mark the contact and stand by. The second torpedo struck at 02:47 hours. SS Empire Stalwart, a British freighter carrying steel and ammunition, took a single torpedo amidships that detonated its cargo in a secondary explosion felt throughout the convoy. 23 men died instantly. The third torpedo followed at 03:08 hours, hitting SS Canadian Logger and sending lumber and aviation fuel floating across dark waters where survivors struggled in 50-degree temperatures that gave them perhaps 20 minutes before hypothermia claimed them. Harrington felt each loss like a physical blow, but the mathematics were clear in his mind. 3 submarines attacking meant 3 submarines that had exhausted battery reserves during their approach runs and would need to surface for recharging within 18 to 24 hours. Every torpedo fired brought German boats closer to the vulnerability window, where engineering limitations would force them into perfect killing positions for patient American destroyers. By 0400 hours, the attacks had stopped. 5 merchant ships lost, 137 men dead or missing, and not a single German submarine damaged by American counterattack. To anyone watching from the merchant vessels, it appeared that the destroyer escort had failed catastrophically in its primary mission of convoy protection. Lieutenant McKenna approached Harrington as dawn began breaking over the Atlantic, revealing oil slicks and scattered debris from the night's attacks. "Sir, with respect, we just watched 5 ships go down without firing a shot in return. The merchant crews think we're cowards or incompetent. Half our own destroyer captains are ready to request your relief for failure to engage enemy contacts. We need to do something before morale collapses completely." Harrington pulled out a chart covered in pencil marks showing every U-boat contact position over the previous 24 hours. Each mark was labelled with precise timestamps and estimated submarine course and speed based on subsequent attack positions. XO, look at this pattern. U-538 made initial contact at 07:15 yesterday morning. It's been shadowing us for 21 hours. Which means it's consumed approximately 70% of battery reserves. It has to surface for charging within the next 4 hours or risk complete power failure while submerged. He traced his finger across the chart to show 3 additional submarine tracks. U-637 attacked at 02:33 hours from this bearing. Based on its approach course, it was running submerged at 4 knots for at least 3 hours before the attack, which means it's already critical on battery power. U-758 attacked from here at 02:47 hours after a similar submerged approach. U-419 hit the 3rd ship from this position after coming in from the north. McKenna studied the chart, finally beginning to understand what his captain had been planning. "You're saying all 4 submarines are going to be forced to surface within the next 6 hours because they've exhausted their battery reserves?" "Not approximately, XO. Exactly. Type 7C submarines carry 120 kilowatt-hours of battery capacity. At 4 knots submerged speed, they consume roughly 5 kilowatt-hours per hour. Every single one of these boats has been running submerged for most of the last 24 hours. They have no choice but to surface for diesel charging between 0600 and 1200 hours today, and when they do, we'll be waiting in exactly the right positions to catch them vulnerable on the surface." The executive officer looked at the pencil marks representing German submarines that had just killed over 100 Allied sailors, then back at his captain's calm face. "Sir, you let those merchant ships sink so you could track submarine battery consumption patterns." Harrington's voice carried an edge that suggested he'd been asking himself the same uncomfortable question. I let those ships get torpedoed because pursuing the U-boats immediately would have achieved nothing except making me feel better about following doctrine. The mathematics are clear, XO. We can kill all 4 submarines within the next 12 hours, or we can chase them pointlessly while they escape to sink another convoy. Those are the only 2 options that physics and engineering allow. I chose the option that saves more lives over the next week, even if it costs lives tonight. The moral calculation hung between them like smoke from the burning merchant ships still visible on the horizon. Military command always involved choosing between bad options, but conventional doctrine at least provided the comfort of established procedures that distributed responsibility across institutional authority. Harrington's approach concentrated all the moral weight on individual decisions that couldn't be hidden behind standard operating procedures or blamed on inadequate doctrine. As dawn light strengthened across the Atlantic, Harrington began positioning his destroyer group for the phase of battle that everyone else thought had already ended. USS Borie moved to a position 12 miles northeast of the convoy, exactly where mathematical analysis predicted U-538 would surface for battery charging. HMS Wanderer took station 15 miles southwest, covering the area where U-637's battery consumption pattern should force it to surface. USS Gough and HMS Viceroy positioned themselves to intercept U-758 and U-419 based on similar calculations. The remaining 2 destroyers, USS Clemson and HMS Vanessa, maintained convoy escort positions to protect against any additional submarines that might be operating in the area. Harrington had gambled his entire tactical reserve on mathematical predictions about enemy engineering limitations. If his calculations were wrong, or if German submarine captains chose to run their batteries to complete exhaustion rather than surface predictably, the convoy would be catastrophically vulnerable to any follow-up attacks. Lieutenant McKenna stood beside his captain as Borie's engines pushed the destroyer toward its intercept position at 28 knots, spray flying over the bow as the ship cut through moderate swells. "Sir, what happens if they don't surface where you predicted?" "What if? German doctrine has changed and they're willing to risk battery depletion rather than follow predictable charging patterns? Then we'll have failed, and I'll face a court-martial for dereliction of duty," Harrington replied calmly. "But Type 7C submarines cannot operate submerged without electrical power. That's not doctrine XO. That's physics. When their batteries hit 20% remaining capacity, German captains will surface to charge, or they'll drift helplessly underwater until they suffocate or collide with something solid. Engineering reality doesn't care about tactical preferences." The waiting began at 06:15 hours, as Borie reached its calculated intercept position and reduced speed to 15 knots to maximize ASDIC detection range. Every man aboard understood they were hunting submarines that had killed Allied sailors just 4 hours earlier, but hunting required patient positioning rather than aggressive pursuit. The crew maintained action stations, depth, charges armed and ready, torpedo tubes trained to starboard, but the target they were hunting hadn't revealed itself yet. Sonar contact at 06:42 hours broke the tension with words every destroyer crew dreamed of hearing. "Bridge." Sonar. Diesel engine contact bearing 047 degrees, range 7 miles. Contact designate Sierra 1, multiple screws, surface target. Harrington felt vindication and dread in equal measure. The mathematics had been correct. U-538 had surfaced exactly where battery consumption calculations predicted it must. But mathematics couldn't account for luck, equipment failure, or the 1,000 variables that separated theoretical victory from actual combat success. German submarines were commanded by experienced officers who'd survived months of Atlantic warfare through skill, cunning, and situational awareness that couldn't be reduced to engineering specifications on a technical manual page. All ahead flank. Battle stations torpedo. Harrington's orders came calm and measured, despite adrenaline surging through his veins. "XO, I want a firing solution on Sierra 1 the moment we achieve visual range. Gunnery, stand by for surface engagement. This is not a drill." USS Borie accelerated toward the contact bearing, her engines driving the destroyer to 32 knots, as the crew raced to battle stations they'd occupied 100 times before in training, but rarely in actual combat. The surface engagement alarm echoed through steel corridors, where men checked weapons, armed depth charges, and prepared torpedo tubes for the kind of ship-to-ship combat that destroyer crews lived for but rarely experienced against submarines that preferred stealth over surface confrontation. Visual contact came at 06:53 hours. U-538 lay stopped on the surface, 3 miles distant, her deck crew visible as they worked to start diesel engines and begin the battery charging routine that would restore electrical power, consumed during 22 hours of submerged operations. The German submarine's lookout spotted Borie at approximately the same moment, triggering frantic activity on the U-boat's deck as crew members scrambled to secure equipment and prepare for emergency dive procedures. But emergency dives required at least 35 seconds under optimal conditions, and U-538 wasn't in optimal condition. Her batteries were depleted to critical levels. Her diesel engines hadn't yet reached operating temperature. Her captain, Captain Lieutenant Werner Schultz, faced the nightmare scenario that every submarine commander dreaded. An enemy destroyer bearing down at flank speed while his boat sat vulnerable on the surface with insufficient battery power to execute a proper dive. Range 2,000 yards. Schultz made the only decision available to him. If U-538 couldn't dive, it would fight. His deck gun crew raced to man the 88mm cannon mounted forward of the conning tower, training the weapon toward the approaching destroyer with desperate speed born from knowing they faced an opponent with overwhelming firepower advantage. The U-boat's first shot passed 50 yards ahead of Borie's bow, close enough that the splash soaked the forward gun crew, but not close enough to cause damage. German gunners were well trained and accurate, but they were firing from a pitching submarine deck against a destroyer making 30 knots through moderate seas. The odds were mathematically terrible, but Schultz's only alternative was surrender or certain death without fighting back. Harrington's response came with the overwhelming firepower that gave destroyers their name. Fire as you bear, main battery, maximum rate of fire, put that submarine on the bottom. Borie's 5-inch guns opened up at 1,500 yards range with devastating accuracy. The first salvo straddled U-538, sending massive water columns erupting around the submarine's hull. The second salvo scored direct hits on the conning tower and deck gun position, killing the German gun crew instantly and tearing apart the pressure hull plating that kept the Atlantic out of the submarine's interior spaces. U-538 lasted another 90 seconds before catastrophic flooding forced Schultz to order abandon ship. The German crew poured out of the conning tower hatch, jumping into cold water as their submarine began its final dive with no one aboard to control the descent. 47 men entered the Atlantic that morning. Borie's crew recovered 31 survivors, including Captain Lieutenant Schultz, who watched his command sink with the stoic acceptance of a professional officer who'd known the risks when he volunteered for submarine service. Harrington stood on Borie's bridge, watching German sailors being helped aboard his ship by American crew members who'd been trying to kill them 5 minutes earlier. The contradiction of naval warfare never ceased to trouble him. These were brave men who'd followed orders and fought skillfully against overwhelming odds. They deserved respect as fellow professionals, even as he felt relief that they'd never again threaten Allied merchant ships. But there was no time for philosophical reflection. The radio crackled with contact reports from his other destroyers. HMS Wanderer had intercepted U-637 at 07:08 hours, sinking it with depth charges after the German submarine attempted to dive before its batteries reached sufficient charge. USS Goff reported engaging U-758 at 07:23 hours, achieving a kill with torpedo fire at 800 yards range. HMS Viceroy confirmed destruction of U-419 at 07:41 hours after a brief surface gun battle that ended with the U-boat's pressure hull breached in multiple locations. 4 German submarines destroyed in 63 minutes, 4 boats that had terrorized convoy, ON-184 just hours earlier, now resting on the Atlantic floor with most of their crews dead. The success rate wasn't 11% anymore. It was 100%, achieved through patient application of mathematical analysis, rather than aggressive pursuit of enemies who'd already escaped beyond effective engagement range. Lieutenant McKenna approached Harrington as Borie's crew secured from battle stations and began processing German prisoners. "Sir." Signal from Task Force Commander. "Admiral Baker wants immediate after-action report and explanation of tactical decisions during the night engagement." Harrington nodded tiredly. He'd achieved unprecedented success using unauthorized tactical modifications, which meant he'd either be decorated or court-martialed, depending on how senior command interpreted his decision to let merchant ships get torpedoed while waiting for mathematics to prove itself correct. Military institutions rewarded successful innovation only after the fact. During the actual execution phase, unauthorized thinking looked suspiciously like dereliction of duty. "Draft the following message to Admiral Baker," Harrington instructed his executive officer. "Engaged and destroyed 4 enemy submarines at positions predicted by battery consumption analysis. 0 friendly casualties. 31 enemy prisoners recovered. Request permission to continue modified tactical doctrine for remainder of convoy escort mission." The response came back within 2 hours, terse and non-committal in the way that flag officers communicated when they hadn't yet decided whether to support or condemn a subordinate's actions. "Proceed as you see fit. Maintain detailed logs of all tactical decisions," Baker sends. May 5th brought validation of Harrington's approach on a scale that even he hadn't anticipated. German submarine headquarters in Paris, operating on incomplete intelligence about the previous night's attacks, had vectored 9 additional U-boats toward convoy ON-184's projected course. Admiral Karl Dönitz believed he was reinforcing a successful wolf pack that had sunk 5 merchant ships. He didn't yet know that 4 submarines from the original attack group were resting on the ocean floor. The new U-boats arrived throughout the day, making contact with the convoy at intervals that allowed Harrington's destroyers to track each one without ever engaging in immediate pursuit. By evening of May 5th, his tactical plot showed 13 German submarines operating in the vicinity of ON-184. 13 boats that would all need to surface for battery charging within predictable time windows, based on when they'd made initial contact and begun submerged shadowing operations. The mathematics had scaled beautifully. What worked against 4 submarines worked even better against 13, because the larger number of targets meant more opportunities to position destroyers for optimal intercept positions. Harrington divided his escort group into 3 hunting teams, each one assigned specific patrol areas calculated to intercept surfacing U-boats during their vulnerable charging periods. The slaughter began just after midnight on May 6th and continued through dawn. U-293 surfaced at 00:15 hours and died under depth charge attack from HMS Vanessa at 00:27 hours. U-647 made the mistake of surfacing at 01:43 hours within visual range of USS Clemson, which sank it with torpedo fire before the German crew could even man their deck gun. U-381, U-509, and U-722 all surfaced within 20 minutes of each other at dawn, creating target-rich conditions that allowed Harrington's destroyers to achieve 3 kills in under an hour. By noon on May 6th, 9 more German submarines had been destroyed, bringing the total to 13 U-boats sunk in 72 hours. Not a single one had escaped. Not one had managed to attack the convoy again after that first devastating night. The mathematics had proven itself with brutal efficiency against an enemy that followed predictable patterns dictated by engineering limitations rather than tactical choice. Commander Peter Ashford, captain of HMS Wanderer, transmitted a signal that captured what every destroyer commander in the task force was thinking. "Borie, this is Wanderer. Whatever you're doing, don't stop. This is the first time in 18 months I've felt like we're actually winning this bloody war. But victory came with costs that mathematics couldn't calculate. 13 German submarines meant approximately 640 crew members, mostly young men in their early 20s, who'd volunteered for submarine service knowing the risks, but believing in their cause and their technical superiority. They died in steel tubes that became coffins when American depth charges crushed pressure hulls, or when diesel fuel ignited and turned submarine interiors into infernos that left no survivors. Harrington stood on Borie's bridge on the evening of May 6th, watching the sun set over an Atlantic that looked peaceful, despite holding the wreckage of 13 submarines and the bodies of hundreds of men who'd never go home. Victory was supposed to feel satisfying, but instead he felt exhausted and vaguely sick at the industrial scale killing his tactical innovations had enabled. Lieutenant McKenna found him there an hour later, holding a message flimsy that had just arrived from Task Force headquarters. "Sir, Admiral Baker wants to see you in person as soon as we reach port. He's convening a tactical review board to examine your methods and determine whether they should be adopted fleet-wide." The destroyer escort completed its mission on May 9th, delivering convoy ON-184 to American waters, with only the 5 merchant ships lost during that first night attack. 48 vessels had survived the crossing, carrying their cargo of tanks, ammunition, food, and fuel that would eventually support Allied operations in North Africa and the planned invasion of Sicily. The cost in merchant shipping was painful, but sustainable. The cost in German submarines was catastrophic for Dönitz's Atlantic campaign. 13 U-boats represented nearly 7% of his operational submarine force, destroyed in a single convoy battle that should have been a German victory based on the first night's success. The Tactical Review Board convened at Naval Air Station Norfolk on May 15th, bringing together senior commanders from Atlantic Fleet Headquarters, Anti-Submarine Warfare Command, and operational destroyer squadrons. Harrington presented his analysis for 3 hours, walking flag officers through the mathematics of battery consumption, the predictability of German surface charging patterns, and the fundamental inefficiency of aggressive pursuit tactics against enemies that could simply hide underwater until American destroyers departed. Captain Thomas Hendricks, still skeptical of any tactical approach that emphasized patience over aggression, challenged Harrington's conclusions with the institutional authority of an officer who'd been fighting the Battle of the Atlantic since 1941. "Commander, your success against convoy ON-184 was impressive, but it required you to watch 5 merchant ships get torpedoed without responding. How do you justify that decision to the families of 137 merchant sailors who died while your destroyers sat idle?" Harrington had known this question would come, and had spent days preparing an answer that satisfied neither his conscience nor his analytical mind. "Sir, I can't justify those deaths except by pointing to the 200 merchant sailors who would have died in the next convoy attack if those 13 U-boats had survived. Military command is always about choosing between terrible options. I chose the option that saved more lives over a 72-hour period rather than the option that made me feel better about following established doctrine." The board members exchanged glances that suggested Harrington's answer had satisfied no one, while simultaneously being impossible to refute. Mathematics were clear, but mathematics didn't account for the moral weight of watching ships burn while possessing the capability to respond but choosing not to. Rear Admiral Wilder Baker, who'd authorized Harrington's tactical experiment, broke the uncomfortable silence with an observation that reframed the entire discussion. "Gentlemen, we're not debating whether Commander Harrington's methods are comfortable or morally satisfying. We're debating whether they work better than what we've been doing for the last 2 years. Conventional pursuit tactics achieve 11% success rates. Commander Harrington achieved 100% success over a 3-day period. Unless someone can explain how aggressive doctrine will suddenly start working better than it has for the last 18 months, I suggest we start implementing his methods fleet-wide." The decision came down on May 20th through official message traffic marked "Secret" for commanding officers only. Atlantic Fleet destroyers were authorized to implement modified engagement doctrine for submarine contacts, emphasizing predictive positioning based on battery consumption analysis rather than immediate pursuit. The tactical modification was presented as an evolution of existing doctrine rather than a revolutionary change, allowing the Navy to adopt Harrington's methods without admitting that conventional wisdom had been wrong for 2 years. Implementation across the fleet took time and training. Destroyer captains schooled in aggressive warfare had to learn patience and mathematical analysis. Sonar operators needed new procedures for tracking contacts without immediately prosecuting them. Convoy commodores had to understand why escorts weren't pursuing every submarine contact the way doctrine had always demanded. But the results spoke louder than institutional resistance. By June, Atlantic Fleet destroyers using modified doctrine were achieving 43% success rates against U-boat contacts. By July, that number had climbed to 61%. By August, German submarine losses in the North Atlantic had reached unsustainable levels, forcing Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his wolf packs from the convoy routes, where they'd operated with near impunity throughout the winter months. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategic impact of Harrington's tactical innovation extended far beyond improved kill ratios or reduced merchant ship losses. German submarine doctrine had been optimized for aggressive Allied pursuit that forced U-boats underwater where they could escape detection. When American destroyers stopped pursuing, German tactical advantages evaporated. Submarines found themselves trapped by their own engineering limitations, forced to surface at predictable times in areas where enemy destroyers waited patiently with perfect situational awareness. Dönitz recognized the problem by mid-June, but struggled to develop effective countermeasures. German submarines couldn't carry more batteries without reducing weapon loads or operational range. They couldn't surface charge in different locations because battery consumption followed mathematical patterns that physics dictated. They couldn't stay submerged indefinitely because electrical power was finite and could only be replenished through diesel engine operation on the surface. The Kriegsmarine's most brilliant tactical mind found himself checkmated by engineering constraints that no amount of tactical innovation could overcome. His submarines were dying at rates that made Atlantic operations unsustainable. His crews were losing confidence in tactics that had worked throughout the winter, but suddenly left them vulnerable to perfectly timed American attacks. And his strategic position was collapsing because Allied convoys were getting through with cargo that would eventually support the invasion of Europe. By September 1943, German submarine losses exceeded new boat construction for the first time in the war. The Battle of the Atlantic hadn't ended, wouldn't end until Germany surrendered in 1945. But the crisis had passed. Britain wouldn't starve. The invasion could proceed. And 30,000 German submariners would never come home, many of them killed by American destroyers that had learned to stop fighting battles they couldn't win and start fighting battles where mathematics guaranteed victory. Commander Daniel Harrington received the Navy Cross for his tactical innovations during convoy ON 184. Though the citation carefully avoided mentioning his decision to let 5 merchant ships get torpedoed while waiting for submarines to surface. He spent the rest of the war training destroyer crews in the patient, mathematical approach to anti-submarine warfare that had proven so devastatingly effective during those 72 hours in May. The moral weight of his decisions never left him. In interviews conducted decades after the war, Harrington remained uncomfortable, discussing the night of May 3rd-4th when he'd watched merchant ships burn while his destroyers maintained screen positions. The mathematics had been correct. The tactical decisions had been sound. But mathematical correctness couldn't erase the memory of 137 men dying in cold water while he possessed the capability to respond but chose not to. Lieutenant Commander Malcolm Sterling, the British convoy commodore whose analytical observations had helped validate Harrington's theories, survived the war and returned to civilian life as a mathematics professor at Cambridge University. He spent the rest of his career teaching probability theory and statistical analysis, occasionally mentioning to advanced students that mathematics wasn't just abstract theory, but rather a tool that had helped win the most important naval campaign in modern history. The German survivors recovered from U-538 spent the remainder of the war in prisoner camps in Canada and the United States. Captain Lieutenant Werner Schultz, interviewed by American intelligence officers in June 1943, provided detailed information about German submarine tactics and engineering specifications that helped refine the predictive models Harrington had developed. Schultz remained a professional naval officer throughout his captivity, answering technical questions while refusing to provide information about operational matters that might endanger submarines still at sea. After the war, Schultz returned to Germany and eventually became an engineering consultant for commercial shipping companies. He never spoke publicly about his experiences during the Battle of the Atlantic, maintaining the submariner's tradition of silence about missions that remained classified long after hostilities ended. But in private correspondence with former crew members, he acknowledged that American tactical innovations in mid-1943 had fundamentally changed submarine warfare in ways that German doctrine had never anticipated. The broader lesson from Convoy ON-184 extended far beyond anti-submarine tactics. Military institutions naturally favored aggressive action and immediate engagement because those approaches aligned with cultural values about courage, determination, and fighting spirit. But wars were ultimately won by achieving objectives efficiently, rather than by following doctrine that felt emotionally satisfying. Sometimes the best way to win a fight was to stop fighting it entirely, at least temporarily, and wait for mathematical certainties, to create conditions where victory became inevitable rather than uncertain. Patience could be more lethal than aggression when applied against enemies whose vulnerabilities followed predictable patterns dictated by engineering reality rather than tactical preference. The Battle of the Atlantic was unique in many ways. It lasted longer than any other campaign of World War II, from the first day of the war in September 1939 until Germany's surrender in May 1945. It covered millions of square miles of ocean where visibility was measured in miles, and contacts were fleeting opportunities that disappeared into vast emptiness. And it was ultimately decided not by the side with better technology or more aggressive tactics, but by the side that better understood the mathematical constraints governing how submarines actually operated. Today, the North Atlantic remains a vital highway of commerce, where container ships cross daily, carrying the goods that support modern civilization. The waters are still cold and unforgiving, still capable of killing anyone unfortunate enough to enter them without protection. But they're no longer a battlefield where young men died in steel tubes or burning oil, while pursuing objectives that seemed worth the cost at the time. 70,000 Allied sailors died during the Battle of the Atlantic. 30,000 German submariners never came home. Their sacrifice purchased something we now take for granted: the freedom of the seas and the ability to move goods across oceans without fear of armed attack. But the campaign was won not just with depth charges and torpedoes, not just with courage and determination, though both were necessary. It was won with patience and mathematics, with the recognition that engineering constraints mattered more than tactical preferences, with the willingness to fight battles where victory was certain rather than battles that felt emotionally satisfying. It was won by officers, like Commander Daniel Harrington, who had the moral courage to make decisions that saved more lives over 72 hours, even when those decisions meant watching people die during the first 24. The 40 U-boats that escaped from American destroyers in May 1943 never actually escaped at all. They were already trapped by mathematics they didn't understand, and engineering limitations they couldn't overcome. The only question was whether American forces would recognize the trap and exploit it before more merchant ships went to the bottom. Harrington recognized it. He exploited it, and within 72 hours, 40 German submarines that thought they'd escaped were resting on the Atlantic floor, never understanding that the moment they dove to evade aggressive pursuit, they'd already sealed their own fate. The Battle of the Atlantic teaches us that sometimes the most aggressive action is patient waiting. Sometimes the best tactics contradict established doctrine, and sometimes mathematics matter more than courage, though we still need brave people to apply those mathematics under conditions where failure means death, and success means watching others die while waiting for certainty. Commander Daniel Harrington understood all of this during those 72 hours in May 1943. The knowledge didn't make his decisions easier or erase the moral weight of command, but it did help win the longest and most important naval campaign in history, one submarine at a time, through patient application of mathematical certainty against enemies who never suspected that their own engineering limitations had become their deadliest vulnerability. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, Check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.